Okay, welcome everyone. So we'll get started um, with a series of webinar, and this is one of the webinars which addresses handling requirements in Agile. Um, a quick introduction. My name is Shashi Singh, and um, I'm an Agile coach, Agile trainer. Um, I also have done transformation for different companies in Agile rollout, and I work very closely with WebAge, which is a top training institution, um, training on Agile, DevOps, and several other technical courses. And they enjoy great reputation. Their reviews are great, working with Fortune 500 and Fortune 100 companies. So this section today will help you depending on where you are in the Agile journey. But it just focuses on the requirement. We do have a real-world Agile course, which is a non-certification course, but it is crafted based on experience working with doing transformation for multiple companies, medium to large size companies across multiple verticals. You have healthcare, financial, insurance, tech, regulated or unregulated companies. So this material comes from a lot of experience. So very helpful. So if you look at this slide in the middle, you see this culture, right? We have been using a lot of tools, a lot of processes, a lot of governance in different organizations. But what we address mainly is the culture, the mindset, how people work together. Is it easy? It seems like cliche. It seems like everyone would be doing it. You would expect that, but you'll be surprised. Big corporations, the collaboration piece is still a challenge. Is still something desired. So we focus mainly on the culture, and even when you are handling requirements, we'll talk about the culture part of it, because there are a lot of tools available, and companies use those tools. There are a lot of process available. There's a lot of governance available, but still we have a lot of pain points when it comes to requirements. So the learning agenda for this real-world Agile, I'll just quickly pass through it, breeze through that. It's pretty comprehensive. Anyone starting with Agile, anyone plateaued in the Agile journey. A lot of companies we come across who have stagnated. They don't know where to go next, right? So this is a very good refresher for them as well. And it covers 3 days, which is very, very hands-on. Covers a lot of exercise and experiential learning, and handles a lot of situation that you will come across when you practically roll out Agile or use Agile. So I always keep this slide. I mean, a lot of times the first question we ask any team, any department or division, or any company across industry when they transition to Agile, what is your motivation behind using Agile, right? And there's a common denominator that people are looking for more agility, more adaptability. The market is changing very fast. It is becoming very, very competitive. Customers are becoming very demanding, right? And the bargaining power in general for the suppliers, for the customers, anyone that you work with is increasing, right? So they are becoming very, very demanding. And demanding means they want faster time to market, right? I want things faster. Faster doesn't mean yet that it's a poor quality. You just deliver something that works for a while and then doesn't work, right? Poor software, a non-working software. By faster mean, can you show me something that you have where I can play around with or experience with and give you some meaningful feedback so that you don't go too far and it becomes a wasted investment, because in the end I might say, hey, this is not what I was looking for, right? So give me something where I can give my feedback to you. And this can be applied to anything that we do. Either we are doing a documentation or or we are doing some marketing. So instead of preparing all the content and then choosing a channel to roll out that content? Can we just select one channel and some content and test it before designing the entire content and using all the channels and spend all the money? So incremental is what we're talking about. So motivation behind Agile, very, very clear, is time to market, quicker feedback. Feedback is the word, quicker feedback. And you can always get quicker feedback when you develop something very small. And therefore, we talk about whatever you want to do, break it into smaller pieces, right? So I will start off with this. If you think back to your worst project ever, I mean, you can write in the chat box, what made it so bad, you know? And what was the one thing you would have changed? So I'll open this to you guys, and I'm sure you must have come across a lot of successful projects, but some of the projects that were stressed out, that really slipped on the schedule, or heads rolled out, and there was a brainstorming that went after the project was completed. What would that be? What made it so bad? Number one. And number two, what was one thing you would have changed? So let me throw this to the audience. Feel free to write it on the chat box. Okay, good. You got some time to reflect. There are several reasons that we uncover when we do this session, especially if we do a very interactive classroom-led, instructor-led session. And there are a whole lot of reasons. First of all, most of it starts with the requirement. When it comes to the development team, it's just a requirement. It's a poorly written requirement or incomplete requirement, inconsistent requirements, too big a requirement, too vague a requirement, have no clue if this requirement, who is the customer for this requirement. When there is dev manager, we get to hear, hey, we have too unrealistic expectations set by the management. We don't have any requirement, but they want a date from us. September 31st, we need to deliver. We don't have any requirement. We just know something about our customer. So we get different reasons. Agile project success, in short, what we have uncovered is based on these three factors. One is incremental delivery, right? So if you're building infrastructure, you're doing a cloud migration, if you're building security around a cloud, if you're moving your applications to mobile, do it in an incremental way. You don't have to do it all at one time, big bang, right? And bi-weekly demonstration, I have put bi-weekly because it's short, but then you can do it more incremental. I'll give an example of a company that we worked with. It's in a grocery chain. I won't tell you the name of the company. And they have been running a POS implementation for almost 3 years. And they had a couple of vendors work on it. So every time the project slipped on schedule, it was over budget, they fired someone in the PMO, they fired the project managers, and maybe they'll pick, a couple of people from the vendor side. So they showed that actions are being taken. But these are all symptomatic. They're not addressing the root cause. So when we were called in to help them, when we talked to them that, hey, for this kind of project where the requirements are constantly changing and the stakeholders are not that engaged and the vendors are not demonstrating what they're building for you guys, can we use Agile? And the head of the development said, hey, don't even talk about Agile. Because here we have a laid back culture. People are not going to come to your daily touch points or the demo every 2 weeks and stuff like that. So when we went in there, we just only did three things. Took the name Agile out. We did three things. We said, hey, do you know what? Can we all, the business and the development team, and the vendor, the representatives of those, can we all come together, not daily, but maybe twice a week, and talk about what did we accomplish last week, and what are we working on this week, and what are some of the impediments which is outside their control that we can take care. So things like that. So we made it, and then we said, instead of doing a 2 weeks demo, let's do a demo after a month, right? And retrospective, instead of doing it after the end of the project, let's do it after every month, things like that. So demonstration, more frequent demonstration, and continuous improvement. So if you look at the Agile manifesto and the principles, a lot of it is around requirements. The first one, if you look at the first one, individuals and interactions over process and tools. We have a lot of tools in place, a lot of process in place in capturing the requirement the right way. But nothing beats where the product owner and the team comes together to plan for 3 to 4 sprints. I'm talking about one team. It could be you can scale it to multiple teams. Then you have multiple product owners, multiple scrum masters. Then you have your stakeholders, the business owner. I'm not talking about SAFe, but you can use any methodology to scale to multiple teams. Like, it's all about individuals and interactions. That is where you find a lot of blind edges on the requirement. You cover a lot of non-sunny scenarios on the requirement, a lot of inputs coming together to form the requirement. Okay. If you look at customer collaboration, here again, sometimes the product owners may not know what they are looking for, because the customer the product owner is talking to, either the intermediate customer or your final customer. Intermediate, the proxy, or your real end user. They may not be very clear about what they're looking for, right? So the product owner may not be very clear with what they're looking for. So they may define very vaguely, but with continuous collaboration, they may tend to uncover what exactly are they looking for, right? And responding to change over following a plan. This again comes in. Responding to change, again, it doesn't mean that any requirement that you have, you change it in the middle of the sprint, or you change it multiple times during the sprint. Like, we had a product owner who at the end of every Scrum meeting, daily Scrum meeting, would say, hey, do you know what, user story 3, I want to make some changes, right? It has a lot of implication. It has to be re-estimated. It has to be re-understood. The test cases will get impacted. So if it happens as a pattern, definitely a Scrum Master has to step in and coach. It's a coaching opportunity for the product owner. But it might happen once in a while. Principles that addresses requirements. Satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Welcome changing requirements. Deliver frequently. Business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. This is the whole reason, because if there are any changes, you uncover that, you find that early than later. Face-to-face communication. Like, again, writing requirements is a collaborative exercise. The first cut may come from the product owner, but flushing it out, giving all the details, making it more granular, is more of a collaborative exercise between the product owner, the stakeholders, and the team. Again, if you look at technical excellence here, is the same thing, continuous attention to technical excellence. And that is where the functional and the non-functional requirements. I have seen product owners address requirements. The non-functional requirements are separate user stories. Sometimes they define it as a part of a user story, which is a functional story. Either it's a performance or a UI or some compliance. They will mention that as an acceptance criteria, right? And then you have this simplicity, again, maximizing the amount of work not done. This is one of my favorite principles. That is where you try to avoid nice to have as much as you can, because you want to maximize the return on the investment. And again, retrospective. A lot of times in the retrospective that I have done, 80% of the times when the team is starting out, they will talk about two things. One is the personality, because they're forming, and the second thing about the requirement. They do not have very clear requirements. The acceptance criteria is not very, very clear. Okay, so if you look at this, this is not a very recent data, but still it remains for those companies which are using waterfall. If you look at the top 3 almost 35% of the reason why most of the projects come under stress or get challenges because of the requirements. And this is very, very clear. Lack of user input, incomplete, changing. And this is more of a reality. And that is what is addressed in Agile by making short increments. You fix your time, you fix your resources, and now you figure out what are the small pieces or small stories that you want to deliver, right? So in the life cycle, if you look at these two roles, very, very critical role, the Scrum Master and the Product Owner. Typically, the Product Owner will collect all the requirements from the executives here. If you look at this, right, the Product Owner is collecting the requirements. The Product Owner will work with the Scrum Master, right? And there'll be two teams, the value team, like the PO has to identify those small set of stakeholders called the value team that drives the requirement, because the PO will not have time to reach out to hundreds of stakeholders. So they must identify and prioritize the stakeholders. At the same time, the Scrum Master must need to figure out which is the core delivery team. There may be some floating members, but the core delivery team. And then the first thing that you do is a chartering based on the vision. Then you do the story mapping. That is, story mapping is where you break down the vision that you've identified in the chartering session into epics, features, or and user stories. Now, this decomposition structure could be different. You can just have epics and user stories. That's okay. You can have epics, features, and user stories. The whole goal is to decompose. Now, can you decompose everything? Probably not. So decompose whatever you can to develop enough work that the backlog can have for 2 to 3 sprints, right? So story mapping is a great exercise. This is facilitated by an Agile coach, maybe a release train engineer, or maybe a Scrum Master, a good facilitator where the team, the product owner comes together, identifies all the epics for the project, and breaks it down into user stories or features and user stories, not going to the task level. That is where the backlog is generated. And once you have the backlog for 3 or 4 sprints, then you pick up one sprint, also called iteration, and then the user stories are broken down into tasks during the sprint, and it goes on and on. Then you have a daily touch point, you have your demo and retrospective. This is in brief your Agile life cycle, right? Now, will you do the chartering and story mapping every sprint? Probably not, because one story mapping should cover 3 to 4 sprint. Okay. One thing very, very important, I think, and I think I have seen some of the teams skip that, especially if they're starting on a project. Even if they have not developed the vision statement during the chartering session, I would highly encourage, even if you're in the middle of the sprint, middle of the your Agile rollout, or you have already gone through a lot of iterations and you don't have a clear vision, come together and find a vision statement, the big picture. Why are we doing this project? And this is very, very handy, very, very handy. Sometimes I have seen in some organizations where you have rolled it out, they become so used to it, they start skipping it. It's like a story point. They become so used to it, after a while they skip story point and they just put 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, something like that. Or user story. After a while they just start writing make a reservation, or simple, like cancel a reservation, instead of writing the whole format of the user story. There is a reason why the format of the user story is used, because so you pay attention to each and every component of it, the value part of it, who's looking for that requirement, why is that person looking for that requirement, and so on and so forth. So you like to resist some of the basics, violating some of the basics, or transgressing some of the basics that we learn before we roll out Agile. Okay, so this is one thing. The story mapping, very, very good exercise. In the beginning of your project, come together as a team, your product owners, some of the stakeholders, your core delivery team, and do a story mapping session. That is where on the top, as you can see, this is like you're developing an email software, right? So you'll have several headings, very high level: organize email, manage email, manage calendar, manage contacts. This can be broken down into a couple of features, like say organize email, you have a search email, file emails. Now the search email can be further broken down. This feature can be broken down into several stories, as you can see here: search by keyword, search by field, search by more than one field, search by attachment, search by subfolders, so on and so forth. Now, How will this work be prioritized? It all depends on the product owner. So once you have this story map, then the product owner might decide, hey, what is going to go in my first release, and then the second release, and then the third release, right? So for first release will become something which is called the minimal viable product, right? Something that delivers maximum value with the minimum investment of time, right? And that is where a lot of companies, they are now going after MVP funding. They provide funding for 3 months, and if it resonates with the customer, then they provide further funding. So MVP becomes very, very critical for the product owner to get a buy-in for the project and for the delivery team as well, to showcase what they can deliver to the stakeholders. Okay, so this is one thing I'll highly encourage you to do it. User story writing. Now, when you're writing your user stories, it has to be collaborative. Right, a lot of new user stories can come from the team as well, especially the technical user stories usually come from the team. But it is always good to have the product owner collaborate with the team to write the user stories. Now, when the product owner, for the most part, they are closer to the customers, closer to the business stakeholders, they will define the vision and the reasons, they'll define the what is needed, they are focused on what and the why, and what matters more, the prioritization, right? Especially if the product owner is coming from a developer background, a part of the development team, there is always a tendency, a propensity to get into the house of things, right? And that is what you want to avoid. You want to have an empowered team, and they need to make the decisions on how to implement that, whether they're going to use Java or Visual Basic, they're going to use this design technique or that design technique, what architecture they're going to use, leave it to the dev team, because you want to get them empowered to make decisions. If they're failing, take accountability and improve, right? For the most part, the delivery team will give a lot of feedback on the technical complexity behind the work. Sometimes the work could be very, very simple, but this is very technically complex, right? So whenever a product owner makes a decision on what to be done now, what to be done later, or what to be done or what not to be done, they take into account two things for the most part. They take into account what is the value that I'm going to get from this requirement or this user feature, and the second thing, how much effort is involved. Two things they take into account. In general, I had a few product owners who will come to me when I was a Scrum Master asking me, hey, Shashi, if this is what I'm looking for, can you get your team to estimate and tell me how long is it going to take? And I will get the team together, take that epic, break it down to user stories, and based on the velocity of the team, I will let the product owner know that it's going to take 3 sprints or 2 sprints. And based on the effort involved, the product owner make a determination whether I should do it or not do it, or if I should do it now or I should do it later, right? So very, very important to involve your technical team. Now, when you're building something, I mean, this is an approach. Now, when I say incrementally, I mean to say if you're developing any component, any system that you're building, you should be able to deliver something that can be used by the customer. It could be very lean. It could be very, very simple, maybe a website, they can use it, or maybe some e-commerce transaction that you're enabling some customer to do with a couple of payment methods, not all the payment methods, but something that the customer can use. If you're rolling out SAP, you don't have to roll out the entire system from the order management to the inventory warehouse to the marketing and production planning. You can just put together one module and get the feedback, right? So this is what I mean. So when you look at iterative, this is a very, very simple example, right? But what I mean to say is, like, when you deliver something to the user, may not be after 1 sprint, maybe after 3 sprints, you deliver to something that the user can use. Very simple, and you get the feedback, right? So say if you're giving to the user a means to go from place A to place B, maybe this might just work. The roller skater can just work, right? If the user gives a feedback, they want to go a little bit faster, maybe the next iteration could be a bike that can leverage some of the competencies or capabilities that we have developed for developing the scooter, for the roller skater. And then if it's faster, then you go for this one, and even faster, you can go for racing motorbike. So what I mean to say is you have to develop more incremental and iterative based on the feedback. And every time you deliver something, it should be tangible. It should be able to, it should be, the user should be able to experience it, play with it, and be able to use it if they want it. It could be having just few features, not all the features, but they should be able to use it. Okay. So this is what I mean by a minimal viable product. Now, even something to keep in mind, now it is very difficult, very difficult. A lot of times there's a lot of resistance from the dev team, from the operations team, even when it comes to building a feature. You'd like to always keep in mind that when you're building anything, when you're breaking down work, you'd not like to break down the work horizontally. Say if you're building a website, you would not like to have, say, let's buy an Azure, or some space in Azure, or AWS, and let's finish installing all the software. Let's scale it to handle so many concurrent users. Get everything together. You spend 3-4 months, and then we build something like an application server, a business logic, and then you build a user interface. If you do this, it will be too late to get a feedback from the user. Um, the best way to do it is have a small space, which you can do it very fast, reserve that space or infrastructure, build some business logic, give some simple user interface, no matter what technology you're getting. So whether you give the user interface, the user can interact and give some feedback to you. And then in the background, now you can work on scaling your software a little bit, depending on how the user load is. You can define your logic based on compliance, based on user requirement, and also you can improve your UI based on the feedback. So it's all incremental. So it's more of a vertical slicing that you'd like to use in your approach to breaking down your requirements, the vertical slicing, avoiding the horizontal slicing. Okay. And then, this is an example, like if you have an objective. So most likely, if you have an objective of the project, which will come from the vision, you'll break down into epics, and then you have your stories. What is an epic? Epic is nothing but a very big user story. Very big user story, right? Whenever you see a user story that is more than 13, it's likely that it's a big epic, right? You like to break it down into smaller user stories. Okay. Okay. So for example, say if you're developing a payment system, right? A lot of point of sale system, merchant gateways that are used. Um, so say you have an objective where you want to improve the speed of payment, right? For that, to achieve that, you have an epic which says that, let's enable multiple mode of payment. That epic will have a story, enable payment using a gift card, right? There may be multiple other options. And that story can be further broken down during the sprint planning by the delivery team or the development team to different tasks, like input options for gift card, code and verify gift card, test entry, verification and confirmation of payment, add test cases, so on and so forth, multiple tasks, right? So this is how the breakdown will happen. The big objective broken down into multiple epics. Epic is broken down into stories. A story is broken down into different tasks. Right. Now, usually in the story mapping session that happens in the beginning of the project, where you're developing requirements for 3 to 4, a backlog for 3 to 4 sprints, you don't go down to the task level. You keep your backlog to epics and user stories. Tasking usually happens during the sprint planning session. And even during the sprint planning session, there are the stories which may not be very clear, right? And this could be maybe a spike, right? So it is very difficult to break it down. So break down all those user stories you can break down. We have enough information to break it down, while some of the user stories can be broken down during the sprint, right? Good practice as a Scrum Master, when I was a Scrum Master, is I would encourage the team members to break it down before they start the sprint planning, because only when the user stories are broken down into tasks, they uncover the complexity behind it, the risk, the issues, the dependencies behind it, and for the most part, they'll come back and re-estimate the user story. So therefore, breaking it down helps in more accurate estimating. Right. Okay. So the user story format, I mean, now it's a cliche. Now Agile is no longer a novelty, and the format of a user story is no longer a novelty. I mean, everyone knows about it, right? But this is very important. especially if you're building a new product, a new system, a new solution, right? You got to know who your customer is, right? Um, uh, there may not be many customers, but I'm sure you have chosen a customer segment, right? From the broader market. You're not going to roll out this solution to everyone, right? So a target, a focused customer segment. And so you got to know your user. For most of the projects that we did, we always had a pilot group of users, right? And that pilot group of users will be our source for requirement, and that is where we will take our product, incremental product, so that they can play around with that and give us feedback. So know your user, who's a user, right? And the user will come from personas. And how do you do your persona depends on how you segment your user. You know, is it demographic segmentation is widely used, right? Is it target towards male and female, depending on the sex? Different age groups, right? It could be different ethnicity. It could be it could be it could be it could be geographical segmentation, right? Depending on different areas that you want to target, right? Which market you want to target. Do you want to target when we are developing a phone for one of the telecommunication company, the new phone was targeted towards Southeast Asian market. So the user there has a different kind of a behavior, a different kind of needs as compared to user in the US market or the European market. So who's the user persona? Define that. Very important. And the product owner should be very clear with that, right? And then, so as a user, you got to define a user. And some of the users could be very internal, right? As an architect, I need that, right? Those are all technical user stories or very functional user stories. As an architect, I need this. Or as an operation, I need that. As an operation, I need a more automated way to deploy the build. Or as a QA, I need some automation of the test cases, whatever it is. But define your persona. I can do something. This is very important, right? What are you expecting, right? What are you expecting to do? So this is where they define what they want. And this is the most important part, the so that user value. This is where you try to avoid a lot of nice to have features in your product. And I think there's a survey, and it still happens in most of the projects that run using waterfall, because the goal of waterfall project is to collect all the requirements up front, because the budget is there, and and they have to spend all the money. That means collect all the requirements, because you might not get the funding later. So the effort is talk to all the stakeholders, spend 3 months, um, get 100 pages of specification, 100 pages of specifications, right? Collect everything, assuming that it's not going to change, but it always changes. The second thing with waterfall project is we never go back to reprioritize our requirement. We just try to build everything. Nice to have or must have. It's only when the project comes into stress and there's a slippage of the schedule that people go back and see, hey, you know what? Now we have 20 things to do. Let's see what we can do, 3 or 4 things, right? But in Agile, it's a continuous prioritization based on value. And the value comes from this third line, as you can see in the format of the user story. As a user, I want this so that I can do this. And I had teams that will always ask the product owner, why do we need this user story? So who is the user for this user story? And why does the user need it? There are several other alternatives to achieve the same thing, right? So when the team gets empowered, and it all depends on how the team is being coached, how the team is being scrum mastered, and what kind of ecosystem the team is operating. Is it a command and control, or is it a more of a servant leadership organization that is being forming as the transformation happens? So the teams will ask those questions, and as a scrum master, I'll always create that safe environment for the team to ask those questions to the product owner. So a lot of times I see this so that missing from the user story. So in one of the companies that we're working with, so after 3 years, when we took an inventory of the user stories, we had some surprising results. The two things that we found. The first thing was, um, we could find as a user I can, but the third line was missing. So that, and that is where the value, that sense of the user story is captured. That was missing for around 70% of the requirement. So they started out right, but at some point they thought that this is irrelevant. I just want to get this one done, right? That was one thing that we noticed. And the second thing was the acceptance criteria. So when we did a query on the Jira user stories, we found around 70% of the user stories did not have a clear acceptance criteria. And we were very surprised because when we got started for the first year and 2 years, and when there were new teams that were stood up and additional teams were standing up, and we were doing it very incrementally. When they started for 8 to 9 months, they will follow the books, but after 8 or 9 months, they started breaking the rules. Now, when we talked to some of the teams, they said, hey, this is shuhari. You start by following a rule, then you start deviating, and then you break. This is the training which we got. So now we have figured out our own way of doing things. Uh, but the opportunity cost is very high when you break rules like this, right? So something to keep in mind. So if you're a dev manager, or if you're a coach, or if you're a scrum master, or if you're a dev team member, or even if you're a product owner, if you get a an urge to bypass, this is some of the best practices, please avoid it, because there's a reason why this is why this is why this is required in the first place. Okay. um, Acceptance criteria. So we talked about acceptance criteria. So whenever you write a user story, and I'm sure most of you, if you have been a part of an agile team, you do a grooming session or a backlog refinement session prior to the sprint. If you're doing a new if a new team is being stood up, um, uh, typically, I have seen some teams have a set up sprint for a week, where among other things, uh, connected to logistics, they also try to get a backlog for 2 to 3 sprints, right? That is where the team comes together, and with the product owner, the scrum master is going to be there, the agile coach will be there, and they will have the user story mapping, right? um, so when the user stories are written, the meat of the user story, or even if you're doing it during the sprint planning session, if you have if the product owner is sharing one user story of another, the meat of the user story is acceptance criteria. And this is so important, and I think, regardless of the teams that we talk to during the assessment, we find that this is one of the issues. Now, it is very, very clear that sometimes the acceptance criteria cannot be defined to that granularity that the team might be expecting, right? But still there should be sufficient clarity around the acceptance criteria so that they can make some own decisions on their own, but still meet the product owner's intent, right? So acceptance criteria helps the QA member of the team, right? The agile team, the people who are doing the testing, because most of the test cases will come from the acceptance criteria. The acceptance criteria also helps the the people who are writing the code, right? And the acceptance criteria also helps in meeting the definition of done, right? So a lot of times, people will move the user story from in progress to done, and then when you go for the demo, you'll find that those stories, they were working in the laptop, but it was not working when it goes for the demo in a QA environment to the stakeholders, right? So you want to make sure that that acceptance criteria is very, very clear to inform the QA, to inform the dev team, to make sure the definition of that done is met before the user story is moved from in progress to done. A lot of times people use done, done, done so many times. We had a clear definition of done set up for the team. Hey, what are some of the things or checklist criteria that you're going to use before you move your user story to done? Maybe it is a code review based on the coding standards, or maybe unit test is completed. Maybe targeted regression for that user story is completed. Whatever the definition of done, only when those definition of done is met, you put your user story to done. So one of the common acceptance, one of the common checklist criteria, the definition of done is your user story is done only when the acceptance criteria is met, right? So be very, very diligent about making sure that you write your acceptance criteria if you're a product owner. Most of the time, I've seen the product owner come with couple of or minimum acceptance criteria during the grooming session, and then takes the remaining feedback from the team to flush it out. what other criteria do we need, right? For example, I always prefer if a product owner is saying, hey, we need to work on improving the application performance, maybe the application service performance, or maybe the lookup time when we click on this button, right? Um, this is very vague. This is very, very vague. And given that a user story should be completed within a sprint, it has to be very, very specific. Typically, a user story should be completed within 2 to 3 days of a sprint. So I would always encourage to quantify it as much as we can. So in this case, where you want from the dev team improvement in performance, I would rather put two acceptance criteria. Assess the current performance and improve the performance by 10%, 15%, 20%, or whatever it is, right? So that gives a clear direction to the dev team as to what the current state is and what is the required future state, right? So make it quantitative as much as you can. Look up time. Hey, it's a 10 microseconds or 5 microseconds when I click on a certain thing, right? Validation, if you have all the fields, which fields need to be validated, which field needs to be required, which field needs to be optional, define that in the acceptance criteria, right? Okay. Okay. Tips for writing good user stories. There's some tips, and we have seen all flavors of user story. Make sure that the user story is small. It's not too wordy. It should be written in a way that a layman can read it and understand it. And therefore, the user story is called a user story. It's a user. I mean, someone who's using an application. They don't need to know what is underneath the application, the technology underneath the application. Whether you're using a big data, and you're using a Hadoop to collect the data, organize the data, and report on the data, or you're using some traditional database, a simple database. They just care maybe if there's a reporting application, they just care how the reports look like, how is it laid out, whether they run it and it's scheduled, on demand, how the output will be delivered, whether in a PDF, Excel, do they have ability to export. Very, very simple way, so that a user can understand. So make sure not put the technical complexity when you're writing user story. The second thing you'd like to do is include the who, what, and why. Who, definitely there has, if you look deeper, you'll always find who's requesting that, right? And why is it needed? And this is where you try to avoid your nice to have features. Remember the principle. Simplicity is the art of maximizing the work not done. There are a lot of things, like sometimes, we had some product owner and working with some of the stakeholders who will say, hey, everything for me is urgent and everything is high priority. My customers need it. But now this customer has a product that is so heavy that it takes a while to deploy that product. And if there is a bug, it takes them a while to figure out the bug. And there are around 20% of the features that is used by only 1 or 2% of the customers, right? And they are very low paying customers. They're not very high revenue customers. They're low revenue customers, just using it 1 or 2% of the time. So you have to make a decision as to what should go into the product, keeping it lean and simple, easy to scale, easy to support and maintain. And therefore, why is very, very important. Why are you looking for that feature? Exclude the how. And as I mentioned, the product owners who come from the dev background, they have a tendency to get into the how. When I was a Scrum Master, I will do my due diligence as my duty towards a product owner to call out that, hey, can we leave the how to the team? You might give the options. You might share there's some alternatives, but the decision needs to be made by the team. And therefore, you need to avoid the how when it comes to user story. Potentially shippable, and that's the reason you would like the requirement to be very, very small, very, very small, so that at the end of the sprint, the feature is built, the feature is tested, and the feature could be tested, meaning you can run the target regression on it, and any applicable performance testing, any applicable compliance testing, whatnot, depending on the definition of done, and then you should be able to deploy it to pre-production. Again, this could be another session, but most of the time, I mean, you don't want to deploy just for the sake of deploying frequently. You have to look at the customer. Are they ready to absorb the pace at which you are deploying? So work with the customer. If I'm deploying every 3 months and they're not willing to get those updates every 3 months, um, you'd like to adjust your release cycle. Okay, and then for acceptance criteria, when you define your acceptance criteria for the user stories, I have seen some product owner make the acceptance criteria like 10 or 15 acceptance criteria on a user story. It's too heavy. Keep it simple, keep it small, break it down into multiple user stories, right? Um, the acceptance criteria shouldn't look like test cases. It clarifies the boundary, what is in and what is out. Sometimes I have seen, be in the grooming session, based on the discussion or collaboration happening between the product owner and the team, um, you know, the product owner will clearly spell out, this is not what is expected in the user story. So the team is very, very clear and not to expand cycles writing a code for that. So clarifying the boundaries very, very important, and stated as an end state. You have to understand the difference between the user story and a task, right? Task will contribute to the completion of the user story. A user story is a small feature, and that you should be able to test, you should be able to deploy, and you should be able to demo. And the user should find it meaningful so that they can give some feedback, meaningful feedback to you. So that is how, and a lot of times I've seen the task becomes user story on the storyboard. So make a difference between what is a user story and what is task. Okay. Okay, and answer the question, what does that look like, right? Tips for writing good user stories. So if you look at this user story, you can see a lot of dysfunctions. You can see a lot of pitfalls of a user story if you just read this. As a product owner, I would like to find out how to improve the availability issues currently facing the site by reconfiguring JMS queues using dev and environment. So typically, I've seen this kind of user stories come from from a product owner who wore a dev hat for a long, long time, right? So they define the what, but they get into the how, right? So as you can read, the next one is a improvement upon what you just saw, what you just heard. As a product owner, I want JMS queues used in DevEnt to fix the availability problem, right? Now again, here you're getting into the hows of things. So the good user story would be, if from the user perspective, as a go live decision maker, I want availability fully tested in a prod-like environment so that I can make an informed decision, right? So that has enough granularity, but it has enough information for the dev team to make a decision and the kind of work that is needed to finish this user story, right? So avoid how, avoid lengthy, keep to the format of who, what, and why. Okay, very, very helpful. Okay, um, larger user stories. So initially, when you're just starting off a project, it's possible that you may have very, very big user stories, right? Very, very big requirements. But as you go down, as you're grooming, for the next sprint. Now, again, there are different techniques that are used for grooming user stories. It could be either all the grooming is done in the previous sprint for the next sprint, maybe taking out an hour or 2 hours of the current sprint for the future sprint, or I have seen some of the scrum masters and the product owners use their daily touch point or the daily stand up very intelligently. They will ask for 15-20 minutes from the team and just groom one user story. So that way it's like, biting off small chunks, one baby step at a time, instead of just taking 2 hours of a sprint and grooming the entire backlog for the next sprint. So you can try different ways of breaking it down. But one of the things that happen in grooming the user story is breaking the bigger user stories. Now, why do you want to break the big user stories into smaller user stories? It's like the small batch. It's a lean principle. The small batches, right? If you have something small, you will see the flow. You'll see the flow. I always have some teams where the user stories are so big, it will hang in the to-do, and then from the to-do to in progress till the end of the sprint. That's a very risky user story. That's a team which is not very dependable. But now they are not dependable because the user stories are so big. It takes a lot of work to complete that, right? So you would like to keep a user story as small as possible, keeping the principle of vertical slicing that we talked about, just a moment ago. Okay, and in the grouping session, if a user story is estimated to be like more than 8 or 13, come up with some best practice that, guys, we are not going to handle any user story which is more than 8 needs to be broken down. We had a couple of teams where we had come up with best practice that to keep the small batches, to keep the flow, to make sure that the user story is not taking more than 2 to 3 days to complete. We are not going to have any user story bigger than 5 story point, right? So come up with some best practice. The whole goal is to achieve smaller user stories, and the goal is to achieve the flow, right? So say for example, if you have this user story defined by the product owner, this is a great candidate for breaking it down, right? So as Tom, the tech operator, I can manage bad jobs so that processes can run unattended and I can be more efficient. Now, there's a lot of requirement hidden in this. It's too vague. This can be broken down into 3 different user stories. As you can see, I can start a bad job, and I can run this unattended, and I can work on other things, right? So that is where the operator becomes more productive, can work on multiple things, right? Again, the second user story can be, I can stop bad jobs as soon as I become aware of the issue, right? The third one could be, I can be notified of the status of a bad job. They don't have to go and ping it all the time, right? Automated way of getting the issues so that they can take the action as and when needed. So this user story, which is like managing the bad jobs, can be broken down into 3 different events. One is start, the second is stop, and the third is notified at any point of time, right? So find opportunities to break bigger user story or slice the bigger user story into smaller user stories. Okay. Now, this is important, but again, this becomes cliche. You have heard this in multiple trainings. So when we stand up a team, we train a team. The team has all the roles in place, the product owner, the scrum master, and agile coach is there for the team for maybe 3 or 4 sprints. Then the agile call moves on to the next team, so on and so forth. In the training, this is covered, invest criteria. So this is the science behind, how do you assess the quality of a user story, right? So independent, this is, I really like this first criteria, the checklist criteria, independent. User stories, if you're having those requirements in a sprint that locks with each other or they're dependent on each other, you'll have a burn down chart that looks flat and then all dips all of a sudden in the last 2 to 3 days of the sprint, which is not a healthy burn down chart, which is, you can't call it a dependable burn down chart or a dependable team because you want to have a very smooth flow or burn down of the chart. So you would like to keep the user stories as independent as possible. There may be some dependencies, but keep it as independent as possible. The third thing, negotiable, of course, the team has to negotiate with the product owner that, hey, you know what fits into this sprint, what can be dealt with in the next sprint, given the technical complexity, some pre-work that needs to be done, so on and so forth. So the product owner should be willing to negotiate with the team. Valuable, very, very important. Small, we talked a lot about it, and testable. You should be able to write the test for the user story, and most of the test will come from the acceptance criteria. So you'd like to use this checklist criteria to measure the health of your user story if you're starting off. Okay. And then you have the epics, right? Epics are very, very important, very, very important because they're the high level requirements that you get from your business. I mean, if you look at the BRD, I mean, if you get the BRD from the user, from the business side, to the product management, the first step would be to get the epics out of that BRD. What are some of the epics that the product management or the product team is looking at? So say, for example, if you're building a browser, right? If you're building a browser, you need some capabilities which are very high level, right? It could be, the e-commerce ability in the browser. It could be entertainment capabilities in the browser. It could be social networking capabilities in the browser. It could be some integration with external application with the browser. Then it could be incognito browsing. That could be another epic. So these are the high level requirement that you need to pick up from the BRD. And then when you get the team together, then those epics can be broken down. Depending on if it is very high level, you need one more intermediate level as feature, or it could be broken down into multiple user stories. So if you pick up, maybe entertainment, entertainment can be broken down into maybe YouTube or video capabilities. It could be your gaming capabilities. It could be your chatting capabilities. Different ways your intended user can use the browser and entertain themselves, right? So so understand the breakdown, and sometimes an epic cannot be broken down fully. So therefore, we have to understand the concept of progressive elaboration. Not everything can be elaborated right away. Sometimes you have to wait for user feedback. Sometimes you have to wait for more interaction with the customer before something can be broken down. So maybe some of the epics could have only 3 to 4 user stories, right? But as you understand more about the epic, you have many more user stories, right? So on and so forth. So remember the word progressive elaboration. We use that progressive elaboration. And the second thing is a decomposition. Make it smaller, make it smaller, make it smaller. As small as you can, right? But understand the difference between a user story and task, right? Don't say a task as a user story, right? Two things, very, very important. Always follow the ready rule. So a lot of times the product owner may come up in the sprint planning session with some of the stories or spikes, um, and they're not very clear, right? So so if they're not very clear, they're not qualified to be brought during the sprint. But it is possible that the product owner may seek help from the team to achieve clarity, right? So to achieve that clarity, they may say that, hey, do you know what? I have this user story. I don't have enough clarity around it, but I want to spike it, get it spiked. Want to find out how we can do it, whether we can do it or not, how much effort is required, and what is going to be in this user story. And that could be a task, and that could be the work for the delivery team for that sprint. So yes, if it is not ready, I mean, you cannot have all the user stories as not ready and make it in front of the team. A portion of it, maybe 10 or 15% of the user stories are not ready and still can be brought in front of the team to seek help from the team based on their experience and technical knowledge. But you'd like to follow this ready tool, just like you have the definition of done. When do you move a user story from in progress to done? You should have something like ready tool. When do you bring your user stories from the backlog into the planning session for the teams to work on? And these are some things, a few of the criteria you'd like to have. The user story should be well prioritized, right? And then it should adhere to the invest criteria, right? Run it through your mind, run mental checklist, right? User story should have good acceptance criteria, right? If the acceptance criteria is not well defined, maybe it can wait for another sprint. Maybe by that time, from the stakeholders that you're working with as a product owner, you might collect those acceptance criteria, right? Or maybe while you're working on other features, that might help you to uncover the acceptance criteria for additional features, right? And you should also know the dependencies identified, especially if a system is being built with multiple components. You'll always have dependencies, right? Dependencies on other teams. And to add to that complexities, other team could be a waterfall team, right? So now you have to sync up on the schedule, right? Hey, we need this in the third sprint, but can you guys deliver this? And the waterfall team, it is very difficult for them it may be difficult for them to prioritize it unless they are made aware of it quite ahead of time, right? So these things should be very, very clear when you are grooming the user stories and when you're bringing those user stories in front of the team during the planning session. Okay. As I mentioned here, some of the backlog item could be which could be further refined, and the user story format is allow a guest to make a reservation. It's a layman requirement as a layman, right? Anyone can read this and understand that, right? Guests can change reservation dates. Hotel employee can see future reservations for the hotel. Sometimes you have an epic X and epic Y. Now, if you see this epic X and epic Y, 30 story points, it means that epic X has a multiple user stories. And what you see here, 30 is a roll up of the story points of the user stories that make that epic, right? So this is also known as the cost of an epic. What is the cost of an epic, right? Cost of an epic in terms of effort is the roll up of all the story points of all the user stories that make that epic, right? Okay. Um, in terms of epics, you'd always like to focus on those epics which are very high value. Just like as you prioritize the user stories, if you're breaking down your BRD, business requirement document, and getting multiple epics, prioritize those epics. Work with the business to tell them, hey, tell me the top 20 things that you're looking for, or top 10 things that is in your mind, right? After you get your epics. Maybe the frequent flyer, they want to focus on the frequent flyer first, as compared to focusing on all the people, all the commuters. So, or flyers. So frequent flyer, what is their need? As a frequent flyer, I want to check my account. As a frequent flyer, I want to book a trip, so on and so forth. And then you can take a user story. As a frequent flyer, I want to book a trip, break it down into further smaller user stories, right? So here we are taking a high value epic, breaking down to user stories. If the user stories are too big, slicing it further down into smaller user stories, keeping it in small batches so that you can have flow during the sprint. All right, this is all I wanted to cover in this session. It's very high level, but I think um, um, in our real world agile that we do for 3 days, it's more of a hands-on. We take you through the user story workshop. How do you get your vision together, and how do you break down your vision into your epics, your features, your user stories? How do you come up with the minimal viable product? What is goes in the release 1, release 2, release 3? How do you do that? Um, how do you get that into Jira? What is the kind of workflow you need to have? Right? Sometimes people have very complex workflow. It looks like a waterfall kind of workflow, things like that. And we cover the different roles that impact the requirements. And the requirements is just one component of Agile. There are various other components that we cover in the real world Agile. Okay. So if you have any questions on this session, I'll be free. I'll be happy to answer. Okay. Any questions so far? Yes, Joe, I think you asked the question, will this be available for download? Yes, it will be available for download. Um, and you can share with your team. Oh, I see. The audio is not good, Joe. I'm sorry about that. Okay, good one. Lack of buy-in. Yes, these are some of the pitfalls of the requirement that I'm saying here. They're very good pointers. Very good pointers. Ruth, you made a very good point, reviewing the plan before coding it. Yeah, Jenny, lot of interest from the original requester or no project sponsor. That's true. That's true. That's true. Dan, you made a very good point here. Some of the pitfalls of the requirements, like change the layers of administrative overhead, approvals before the dev team could start. Yes, we see that many times. Um, no clear directions all the time. change at the last moment. I think we covered. I mean, a lot of times people take Agile for granted and they keep on fiddling with the requirement even in the middle of the sprint. So as a Scrum Master or as an Agile coach, you got to step in. And if the requirements are going to change all the time, use Kanban instead of Scrum. Um, there are better ways of managing it. Um, Good point, Vijay. Um, Functional requirements, yes. So I think there are functional requirements, the features, uh, but you could include a non-functional requirement in the user story, or you can define it separately as a separate user story. When it comes to functional, when it comes to like performance, or it comes to compliance, when it comes to governance, um, those kind of things, or dependability of the feature, availability of the feature, and so on and so forth. So those will go as non-functional. Sometimes a product owner chooses to include that in the requirement. Sometimes they choose as a separate requirement. Um, okay, this is a very good point. I think Saraswati has asked, how do you assign story points for a QA task? So the story point is always, as the name suggests, it is assigned to a story. It is not is assigned to a task. The task usually is, I have seen some of the team members, some of the teams, they use hours just for their own um, uh, convenience to manage their work. But at the user story level, you just have the story points. Thanks, David. I'm glad you found it helpful. Can you explain the term spike? Spike, Glenn, is, which is a research item. Um, there are some questions that needs to be answered, right? So we had, I will give an example. When we were building a live view in a browser, um, we were having a lot of performance issues because we were taking news items from across the world. So for a specific country, say if we target a specific country, say Brazil, we would like to get all the sports news and prioritize it and then display to the user the top 10 sports news. And the technology, that design technique that we're using, it was slowing it down. So we had to go back to the drawing board and we had to figure out, hey, let's explore the other design techniques that we can use to improve the performance, right? So that effort was called a spike. I mean, can we have a better design technique, or can we use a better technology to improve that? So something, a research question is a spike. Um, yeah, Susan, if you're still there, it is not uncommon to see team members working on multiple support tasks. I mean, supporting the existing application, we're working existing. I have seen team members work on 3 to 4, 5 projects, and I always, that is totally dysfunctional. So the product owner needs to prioritize the backlog, and the scrum master needs to work with those team members and find out what is something that they're working on which is outside the scope of the sprint, and have the conversation with the functional manager. Most of the times the day-to-day support task is coming from the functional manager, their bosses. um, One way I have dealt with it is have some capacity for support and maintenance. Like, I will have, based on the historical pattern, I'll have 20% of the time cut out for support and maintenance, or something which is unexpected flowing into the team. Because at the end of the day, I want the team to feel happy and satisfied, and not overwhelmed. Because if they're overwhelmed, we're not creating a sustainable pace. And this is one of the agile principle, right? To create a sustainable pace for the team. Um, so yes, cut out some time, some capacity out of the velocity to address those unexpected day-to-day tasks. It's a good question. Um, Saraswati, okay, did you get my question? Okay, thank you, Salesh. Yes, we can share that with you. Patricia, you have asked, do you have an example of a um, user story for data warehouse project? Yes, we can share that with you. Thanks, Andy. How to determine feature versus epic? Mahesh, again, this is just a thumb rule. Yeah, the goal is to break it down. decomposition. And if you know, this is in the standard PMI world, we used to do that, right? The work breakdown structure, if you remember, the whole goal was to break it down into smaller deliverables. So sometimes I have seen that teams use 3 levels. I personally have felt very comfortable keeping it at 2 levels: epics and user stories. Um, but depending on the different technique, I mean, in the safe world, I think they use the features, they use the capabilities, the features, the stories. So the whole goal is, underlying goal is, break it down, right? You don't need to have a feature, right? Feature, if you call, what is a feature? Feature is a bigger epic. An epic is a bigger user story. Glenn, okay. Dan, estimating task goes away as teams mature and they focus on the story point exclusively. Yes, yes. I have also seen teams just work on the user story. They don't break it down into smaller task, right? And if that is how they are comfortable with, and they have been achieving their sprint commitment as a pattern, great. I mean, it's all about, you know, how the team is doing, and if they have any problems, we take it in retrospective and figure out a way to solve it. So yes, and Dan, I'm with you. Um, Even they don't task and estimating task, you know, the teams become more mature. You're very right. You're very right. Classes in becoming certified in Agile and Scrum Master. So, uh, Penny, if I understand your question, you're looking for classes to achieve certification, CSM certification. There are a lot of certifications that is available in the market. CSM usually comes from the Certified Scrum Trainer, and um, there's an ACP certification, which is cheaper, and it comes from PMI. Um, I find ACP certification very tough, and I think I hats off to those people who finish this certification. But the market respects CSM more because it comes from an acknowledged body called the Scrum Alliance. So go for any one of them. CSM is very easy, 2 days. Um, no questions, very clear presentation, receiving the deck. Thanks, Paul. Yes, you'll be receiving the deck. How do you handle a project that has fixed budget? Okay, so this is the beauty of Agile. So if you look at waterfall, typically what we do is we fix the requirement and then we flex on the schedule and the cost, right? Um, so in Agile, it's more of an inverted triangle. What you do is you fix your team, you identify your 2 or 3 members of the team, depending on the project. You got to have the right people, right capabilities in the team. And so your budget is fixed. And then your delivery cycle is fixed, 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending on your cycle, right? And then if your budget is fixed, what you can do is you can prioritize your requirements, right? So maybe you use all your budgets, all your entire budget in maybe 6 or 7 sprints. But at the end of the day, um, you'll be very happy to know that you have delivered something which is must-have, very high-value features, features that the customers were really looking for, because you are going to demo that every 2 weeks with your team. So you'll have a more outcome-based, delivery if you're using Agile as compared to waterfall if you have a fixed project, a fixed budget. So I hope it answers your question. Oh, sorry, you meant for the QA story, Saraswati. Yes, yes. So yes. So how do you assign the story points for a QA story, a story for the QA? Yeah, there can be a lot of stories around QA, especially if you're building the test infrastructure, like for example, automating. your test cases, manual test cases. Those could be user stories. That is work, right? And I think the people who are from QA, they have more capabilities as compared to other team members. So yes, it has to be sized just like any other user story. Okay, okay? So you are using the support and maintenance, Saraswati. So you're using the support and maintenance bucket to assign estimate to your user stories, which are more QA related. Okay. Okay. Ruth is asking a question. Difference between task and user story. Difference between task and user story. Okay. So a task will be a task is something which will not have an acceptance criteria. User story will have an acceptance criteria. A task you will not be demoing. It's very difficult to demo a task, but a user story you should be able to demo. So testing, being testable, being able to demo will differentiate the user story and task. Um, Role of a GUI storyboard in communication with users. Okay, so difference between task and user story. Role of GUI storyboard in communicating with users. Okay, so Ruth, if I understand your question, sometimes a lot of user stories comes from um, a workflow diagram, or maybe even comes from the user interface, like a mock screen that has been created. A lot of user stories come from that. Um, that could be one way of getting the user stories. So, okay. All right, I think as we're at 1:15, we're 15 minutes over time. Please feel free to send your questions to us. We'll be happy to answer those questions. If you want to call us, I mean, I'll be happy to take your call and answer those questions. But I hope it was helpful in some way or the other. I think in the interest of time, we cannot cover everything, but I look forward to see you in some of the trainings in future. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great weekend.